Hey listeners, thank you so much for listening to HRN. We want to make your experience as a listener even better, and to help us do that, we'd love your input on our audience survey. It'll only take a few minutes, and by completing it, you can enter to win a $250 gift card from Goldbelly. Visit heritageradionetwork.org/survey to take the survey and to help us keep growing and improving. That's heritageradionetwork.org/survey. Thanks for your support.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Welcome to Inside Julia's Kitchen, the podcast of the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts. I'm your host, Todd Schulkin, the Foundation's Executive Director. Our show takes you inside the Foundation's world to meet the talented people we have the great fortune of learning from all the time. On today's show, we welcome back culinary historian and author Sara Franklin. In this episode, we'll talk to Sara about her recent biography, The Editor, about the legendary publishing icon Judith Jones. And we'll hear Sara's second Julia moment. We're picking up where we left off in the spring with a couple of special book-related episodes this fall. And, as always, we launch the conversation with an inspiration from Julia. If it was not for the Knopf editor Judith Jones, there might not have been a Julia Child. Judith was Julia's editor for nearly all her cookbooks. Most cogently, Judith was the editor who took a chance on mastering the art of French cooking, fighting hard for Knopf to agree to publish what was viewed as a lowly cookbook. Prior to Julia, when Judith was still an editorial assistant, Judith advocated publishing the Diary of Anne Frank in English after discovering the manuscript in French in the rejects pile. This set up Judith on a career not only as editor to Julia, but to writers like John Updike, Ann Tyler, Edna Lewis, and Joe Nathan, to name only a few of her famous writers. To say Judith was a force of nature is not an understatement, but she was also an understated person. She was someone tough enough to give Julia critical feedback, but also someone who did not seek the spotlight, preferring to keep her authors front and center. Just as Julia owes a debt of gratitude to all Judith helped make possible for her, we owe Judith recognition for her far-reaching contributions to the culture. Someone with a deep understanding of Judith's character and importance is Sara Franklin. We met Sara in 2018, back in episode 14, at the publication of Edna Lewis, At the Table with an American Original, a book of essays about Edna's life and work, which Sara edited. Sara is a professor at New York University's Gallatin School for Individualized Study, teaching food, oral history, embodied culture, and nonfiction writing. As a writer herself, Sara has written for publications including The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Nation, and Travel and Leisure. The mother of twins, she lives in the Hudson River Valley. Sara joins us today to talk about Judith and Sara's new book, The Editor, How Publishing Legend Judith Jones Shaped Culture in America. Welcome back to the podcast, Sara.
Thank you, Todd. It's so good to be back.
We're delighted to have you back talking about such a great topic, certainly one near and dear to Julia Child's heart. So how did you first fall in love with Judith Jones and her unsung story?
I first even came to know about Judith Jones after she published her memoir in 2007, The 10th Muse, My Life in Food. I had grown up in a household with a mother who really resented the work of cooking. She worked full time, so getting dinner on the table every night was something she considered a chore, and she tried to make as quick and easy as possible. But I grew up loving to eat, and I was really drawn into the space of the kitchen. And so I used a combination of cable food television, which was really just debuting when I was in middle school, and then also the few cookbooks that we had in our house growing up, which included The Joy of Cooking, the Fannie Farmer Cookbook. That's how I taught myself to cook, through experimentation. But when I left for college and began living in Boston, I was able to expand my range a little bit. And so I began wandering through the streets of Boston and Cambridge, poking into little grocery stores, but also into used bookstores. And it was there that I really began my own collection of used copies of many of the cookbook authors that Judith Jones worked with, though at the time I had no idea that Judith was the link between them. People like Marcella Hazan, Edna Lewis, Marion Cunningham, Julia Child, of course. I had never seen those cookbooks before. I did not grow up in a family that had a wide interest in matters of the gastronomical. And so these were discoveries for me. They were aha moments. They were a way to expand my palate, but also my cooking repertoire. And so when Judith's memoir came out and I discovered it on a table in a bookstore in Harvard Square, all the dots really started to connect for me between the books that had taught me so much and had really opened my world and my sense of what could happen in the kitchen and what cooking could do in terms of where it could take you, what it could teach you. And to recognize that there was a single woman behind many of these authors, for me, was a revelation. And I also learned through reading that book, The 10th Muse, that Judith also had a literary career. I didn't learn much about it in that book. She didn't write much about it in that book. But I began to see that she was a person who had twinned passions of food and language, which were my two passions as well. And I didn't see many like her in the world. And so I sort of quietly adopted her as something of a mentor. I didn't know her at the time. I had never had a chance to meet her, and I never imagined that I would. But I recognized that she had carved a unique path that combined interests that I didn't see coming together much in the world. And so she became an important figure to me long before I had the chance to meet her. Now, fast forward to 2012, and the Julia Child Foundation had written to the Columbia Center for Oral History looking for some help in collecting Judith's oral histories. She had recently retired from a more than 50-year career at Knopf, and I happened to be in class literally at the elbow of my professor when this email came in and she saw it for the first time. And she looked up at me. I was always the food person in academic spaces. And, people sort of had this attitude of, you can't study that. These are rooms full of Ivy League political science majors and anthropologists and the like. And they sort of thought I was a peculiar creature. But she looked right up at me and said, you're a food person. You might be interested in this. And I peeked over her shoulder and committed the email address to memory. Todd, as it turns out, it was your email address. And I fired off an email right away as soon as class was over and said, look, I don't know what your plans are, what you're thinking, but I'd really like to be involved. This woman means so much to me. And a few months later, I was at Judith Jones's apartment door in Manhattan knocking because the sort of last hurdle to taking the reins of that project and being lead interviewer, which it was something I had never imagined for myself, was that Judith and I needed to like one another well enough to work together. And really that meant Judith had to like me. I was quite certain that I wanted to be in a room with her no matter what it took. And so that was January of 2013. And we had our first meeting in her apartment in the same building in Manhattan on the Upper East Side where she was born and had spent her entire childhood and then had come back to in the 1970s, 60s and 70s to live. And we sort of fell for each other immediately. The sort of first points of overlap that we recognized we were both really pragmatic, unfussy cooks. We had a sort of gut aversion to high gloss celebrity chef culture and cookbooks. We believed in using leftovers. We believed in cooking the way that we live, which was in a kind of ongoing way, not in this big performative way where you put one beautiful meal on the table and then you don't know what to do with all the little bits of cilantro or, the jar of ghee that you've purchased in order to do it, that really cooking should be part of the rhythm of your life. And so we took to one another right away. And that began 6 months of working together on interviews, but also a deep and abiding friendship that lasted until she died in August of 2017.
Well, it's so wonderful that worked out. That was very early in my career with the foundation too. So I hadn't put those two things together, although I very much, remember this desire to try to capture as much about Judith as possible, not knowing how much longer we would have with her. And as it turned out, it was very fortuitous in terms of timing and the amount of information you were able to get. And then wonderful that you were able to distill all of that into a beautiful book and portrait of her as a full person, as an editor, including Julia's view, but that was very much the Foundation's intent, that we felt like she was kind of an unsung hero / certainly literary hero. And it would be great if more people understood that. So we're grateful that you guys hit it off. Otherwise, maybe it wouldn't have been so successful.
Well, the feeling is very mutual. This book wouldn't exist without the funding that was provided for that project and the support and the access to Judith. Those interviews were just the foundation. What happened afterwards was years and years of research, talking to people that Judith worked with, both at Knopf and some of her authors, her family members, her friends, but also deep, deep, deep archival work. But without those interviews, I would have had no clue what Judith herself thought about many of those people and events. And that first-person perspective really gave me the ability to write this book with a sense of intimacy with Judith at the helm.
You mentioned before, in having read her memoir, that you had this instinct that a lot was left out. It was very selective. And you kind of mentioned the literary side of Judith. And I was curious because I do think it's not unheard of, but it is unusual. Most editors specialize in one or maybe two genres of writing, and usually they're kind of closely related. But Judith's cadre of writers was at least seemingly unrelated. What did you think made Judith so versatile? Or do you see that actually there's an obvious connection, or a less obvious but obvious connection to who she worked with?
I really love this question. I think part of what made her such a good editor was her breadth, was that she was working across genres, in part because it meant she never got bored. She herself remained curious and interested because she was bounding from poetry to nonfiction to reportage to cookbooks to fiction, novel after novel with Ann Tyler and John Updike, as you said earlier. But I think it also really allowed her to sharpen her sense of what different genres were good at doing. So, for example, the difference between, let's just stick with food for a moment, between what would befit a culinary memoir as opposed to a cookbook, or what really belonged in a recipe and a headnote instead of perhaps in a poem. And the place I see the clearest link is between poetry and cookbooks, because the project is in some ways very similar, though the form is totally different. But the project of both a good recipe and a good poem, a well-written poem, is to evoke sensory experience, lived experience, whether that be touch, breath, taste, heat, right? And to do it in as distilled and concise language as possible. And so I think her early and lifelong interest and work with poetry made her very well suited to be a very, very, very good cookbook editor, because she understood the precision and really paring language down to the fewest possible words, but of course the most beautiful and the right words really mattered in terms of capturing and keeping a reader's attention, particularly in a cookbook, if you're trying to introduce a reader cook to a recipe that they may never have seen or tasted before. And so that ability to really evoke the sensory to help them understand what something should look like or smell like or feel like at a certain stage in the recipe's preparation was really vital, certainly before the advent of full color photography in cookbooks.
Yeah, no, that is a neat analogy, one that I've never thought of before, but certainly even the format of how a poem looks or can look and a recipe is kind of more similar. At the same time, I was curious if you thought, because I think Judith was discerning about what cookbooks she did publish, cookbook authors, but also that we'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of the role of an editor. But do you think there was something about her literary background that influenced her choice of authors and cookbooks that she worked on?
It's a wonderful question. I think that she was looking for a certain level of intelligence, and that's not to say book smarts or schooling, but Judith really was interested in people who were autodidacts, who had really made a project of discovering the world, of being creative in the world, of becoming expert at something. And so she was drawn to author cooks who, like her, had started out as amateurs. She very famously did not publish many restaurant chefs. She wasn't particularly interested in how they cooked. She thought it had very little relevance to home cooks like herself. She was much more interested in people who cooked the way that she did, which was every day, but at home with the equipment and the ingredients and the time that home cooks have. We could argue a little bit about whether Julia Child fits that bill. She's somewhat of an exception, but indeed she did begin as a home cook, and she honed her craft in a home kitchen, right? That's really where she learned to do what she did. It's where she tested the recipes for mastering the art of French cooking that we all know and love so well. But I think that Judith wanted a kind of seriousness and a rigor in the authors that she worked with. And she also wanted a spirit of adventure. She wanted people who were fearless, who were willing to go out on a limb, both with the way they cooked, but also with their writing. So Lidia Bastianich talks about this when she speaks about Judith, which was that Judith would push her further and further and further to be very, very descriptive with the language that she put into her recipes and headnotes, to link a certain recipe to a story from her upbringing or for one of her return trips home to Italy. She wanted readers to feel drawn into the lives of her cooks, not just to be able to replicate the recipes that they put on the page well. So she was as interested in the people as she was in the food that they put on the plate. And I think that's part of what makes many of the cookbooks that Judith edited so evergreen in their appeal, is they feel intimate. They feel very, very particular and specific to their authors.
That's interesting. And also, like, what you say about Julia is she was that autodidact. You know, when Julia decided she wanted to learn about cooking, she needed to know frickin' everything. And that because that was how she was programmed. It wasn't even like a choice. She didn't feel like if she didn't know all the whys and hows and ins and outs, she really didn't understand it. But as you say, that kind of made her perfect for Judith as an editor. So on that note, do you think that Judith and Julia had a particularly unique relationship as editor and author? Or maybe that's to say they had a typical relationship of Judith and her authors that may be more atypical for other editors?
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction. Certainly when Judith and Julia began working together in 1959, when Judith had fought to acquire the book that became Mastering the Art of French Cooking, and first began working with Julia Child, which began entirely over transatlantic post. They didn't meet one another until over a year after that book was acquired, which I think is so interesting. They got to sort of play out their practice with perfecting language in writing back and forth to each other, because they didn't have the interpersonal interaction in real life to fall back on, right? The writing had to be good. It was how they got to know one another and how they took the measure of one another's character and skill. So I think some of this is that it was the first time that Judith Jones worked on a cookbook, and she was hell-bent on proving herself, both to Julia Child and also to Sim Quebec and Louisette Berthold, but also to the higher-ups at Knopf. And so she worked so doggedly on that manuscript. That was her way as an editor more broadly, that is true. But I think the fact that it was the first cookbook she acquired at Knopf and that she knew she would not get a chance to do another if she failed meant that she lent even more of her time and attention to this particular manuscript. Now, Julia Child was also a perfect author for Judith. And it's so interesting to me, both in my conversations with Judith, but also in looking at the correspondence between the two of them from the late 1950s and early 1960s. The two of them were sort of quelling back and forth at one another and how good they were at their respective jobs. I mean, it's really quite wonderful to see that as they begin this process of stripping the manuscript back down and rebuilding it so that it really works for an American audience, so that it is leaner and more successful, that Julia Child writes to Judith and says, how lucky we are that you are such a keen editor. And Judith writes back to Julia, how lucky I am that you are so hardworking and so willing to test these recipes again and again and again until they are as close to perfect as they can possibly be. And so they're really recognizing in one another a shared work ethic, which I think is very difficult to come by in publishing, particularly in contemporary cookbook publishing. And certainly was not part of the fabric of American food culture. There was no cookbook culture to speak of, but not of American food culture in terms of taking home cooking very, very, very seriously and lending to it all the editorial and literary rigor that Judith would to other works of literature. So I do think there's a uniqueness there. And I think something that you never see again in Judith's career is the sense of indebtedness she had to Julia Child. You know, those two women perhaps, and I would say probably, would not have been who they were in the world of food without the other. And they really recognized and honored that contribution that the other had made to their career, their ascendance. And I think you feel that throughout the decades that they worked together. It was not a perfect relationship. It was a decades-long working relationship. And like a long marriage, it had its ups and downs. They had their disagreements, certainly. They didn't always see eye to eye. But I think that sense of reverence and respect for the other as a hard worker, as someone with integrity, and for someone who really valued excellence in printed and published work, but also on the table, was something that they never lost sight of.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting what you said about intelligence and using that maybe, if you will, with a small I, that part of what you said about Julia, and when you read her letters, her voice is so strong and so distinctive. You can even sit with them now and feel like she's with you. And that would have come across to Judith, that Julia just, it goes down to this natural curiosity, so that Julia was always interested in everything as per her advice. And it seems like Judith was a more introverted personality than Julia, but would you say she had the same kind of inherent curiosity that propelled Julia?
It's an interesting observation. I don't think that I think of Judith as introverted, but she was certainly more private. She was really, really intent on keeping a lot of her life to herself and out of the public eye, particularly as she became more in demand in the late 60s and 70s. But I don't think she was particularly introverted. They certainly shared that curiosity, that sort of insatiable, bottomless curiosity to know more, to have an experience of a broader world, to meet people who were different than they were and learn from them. And again, I think that's something that really brought them together. I think it formed the basis of a sense of shared politics, which was really believing in people's humanity, believing that different people had different things to bring to the table and that all of those things were valuable, and remaining really open to learning as amateurs across their lifespans.
All right, after the break, we'll be back with more from culinary historian Sara Franklin. Stay with us.
Whether you're a chef or just love going to restaurants, you know the best ingredients are everything, especially when it comes to beef. In Northern Australia, there's a different approach to raising high-quality beef. Westholme, based in Queensland and Northern Territory, is working with the land to create nature-led Australian Wagyu. Westholme stewards 16 million acres of rangeland guided by their natural ecosystem. They're led by a belief that if they balance the needs of their cattle with the needs of the environment, both can thrive. Westholme's team of rangeland experts and nature managers use a variety of tools to monitor and respond to the welfare of the environment, like satellites that assess grass health and on-the-ground research. Cattle are happier when they have the freedom to forage and explore, so Westholme ensures that they can roam wild, foraging at will for the first 2 to 3 years of their lives. Their cows graze on native grasses like Mitchell grass, which is only found in Australia, along with dozens of other plants, herbs, and seasonal legumes. The result is a high-quality Wagyu beef that reflects the terroir of Northern Australia and a flavor suited to complement any cuisine. Westholme believes that when nature leads, flavor follows. Learn more at westholme.com.
Attention all Julia Child fans, American history buffs, and kitchen design addicts. The new book, Julia Child's Kitchen, The Design, Tools, Stories, and Legacy of an Iconic Space by Smithsonian curator Paula J. Johnson, is out now from Abrams. Paula will be on the show soon to tell us all about it. Ask or search for it at your favorite bookseller. Proceeds from the book benefit the Julia Child Foundation and the Smithsonian. Welcome back. We're talking to culinary historian Sara Franklin about Judith Jones and her newest book, The Editor, one of the first biographies about Julia's legendary editor and close friend. Okay, Sara, I'm bracing myself. I know you had some specific feels about the recent Mac series Julia, which featured a fictionalized Judith Jones as Julia's editor, as well as Judith's bosses, Alfred and Blanche Knopf. So, Sara, what did the show get right and get wrong about Judith and her relationship with Julia?
I'm glad we're zooming in on just one relationship because this could easily take up several episodes. I think the sort of initial bee in my bonnet was that the series portrayed Judith so much as Julia Child's sidekick and suggested that Judith herself, though she loved to eat, which indeed was true, the two women absolutely shared a penchant for pleasure and taking pleasure unabashedly, right? They refused to apologize for the fact that they were women from some quote unquote breeding, and that they loved to eat and would eat with, great gusto. That said, early on in the series, the sense you get is that Julia Child knew a great deal and Judith Jones knew almost nothing. And I think that's a really unfair portrayal because, in fact, one of the first things that Judith and Julia realized they had in common was that they had both really learned to cook in Paris within a year of one another. Now, Julia Child did go to culinary school, and so she certainly had more technical training. She had more expertise than Judith Jones, and no one would argue that Judith Jones was as much an expert in French cooking as Julia Child. That's certainly not what I'm trying to say here. But the idea that Judith Jones was always sort of following Julia around like a lost puppy and just sort of attaching herself to this ascendant star of celebrity that was Julia Child, I think is a real misrepresentation. And the part that feels most central to the mistelling to me is that it misses what I alluded to earlier, was that these two women really built their careers in food upon one another's shoulders. They were deep collaborators. They needed one another to clarify their thinking, to sharpen their skills, but also to really take off in their respective fields. Julia as an author and later a TV personality, and Judith as an editor, and specifically a cookbook editor. And so I sort of resented might be a bit strong. I was disappointed in this idea that Judith was nothing but Julia's sidekick. And I would say ditto for her other authors, that she was always behind the curve. I saw Judith very often as far ahead of the curve. It's part of what made her a very, very good editor. I also think the series portrayed her as a bit silly, a bit of a dilettante, a bit flippant, sometimes even flaky, and also very, very rich. And none of those things were true. She did come from privilege. It's important to acknowledge that. But for example, in the second season, there is a scene where she's in the kitchen with her husband cooking in Manhattan, and it suggests that she has a multi-floor duplex in Manhattan. Judith did not have that kind of money. She didn't come from that kind of money, and she didn't make that kind of money. And so one of the things that I think the series really does a disservice to is pointing towards some of the inequity in Judith's pay, in particular, Knopf. They show her in the first season in a sprawling mid-century office at Knopf with windows and room for a couch. Judith didn't even have her own office until a couple of years after she acquired Mastering the Art of French Cooking. So I think it's a great disservice to Judith specifically as a character and to the relationship between Judith and Julia. But I think it's also a disservice to really correctly historicizing women in the workforce and in publishing in particular.
And did they get anything right?
Yes, certainly. I mean, the pleasure, the zeal with which those two women lived and cooked and did those things together is absolutely accurate. The way in which sometimes they went head to head. There are these wonderful scenes in the second season where they're in Provence together. There's a lot that's inaccurate about those scenes, but the kind of power play, the power struggle between the two of them, also Simone Beck, who's present in a lot of those scenes, is very true. And it's part of what made the books better, right? Was having to really lay all your cards on the table and explain why you wanted to include or exclude certain recipes, or why certain ingredients would be important to include for American cooks. So I think some of that detail is really well done. I think it feels hard to put stock in the series as a whole because of how much fictionalization there is. Well,
and yes, and that's very true for listeners and watchers or future watchers. It is a fictionalized series. I mean, I have to say, Sarah, I feel like it's almost like you're a family member, because I think watching fictionalized biographies of real people for the people who really knew the subjects is always extremely difficult, because it's never, even when it's trying to do a straight biography, very hard to capture the real person in the way that people close to them. I mean, to me, I never took away any of the, I read all the scripts before it was made, the things that you're seeing, and I can see them on camera, but I think they maybe leapt out to you with your intimate knowledge in a way that others would not take them away. So I encourage listeners, if they haven't watched, it's still on Max, to watch the 2 seasons and draw their own conclusions. I do want to pick up on something that you did talk about, though, in that regard, that I think is really interesting. And particularly, I've read some of the analysis of your biography as well, where I felt like people kind of missed the forest for the trees and like wrote a lot about an editor's job and whether it's mysterious or vague, when that to me really was not the point of your book. And also that they also missed the point, the bigger point of what editors do, which is well beyond correcting grammar, but they're really kind of cultural gatekeepers and guides. They have a lot of power in deciding what does and doesn't get published. And even though they have a lot of fights with their publishers about what does and doesn't, they are still this, at least to me, gatekeeper. And so I was curious how you view, and that's in the subtitle of your book, is do you view Judith as a deliberate or an accidental shaper of American culture? Like, how much was that in her mind in her selection process?
Great question. I think it's a mix of the two. I think as it pertains to Julia Child specifically and mastering the art of French cooking, Judith had a hunger for a book like that. She never could have imagined that book precisely that came and dropped onto her desk in manuscript form in 1959. But she wanted to learn how to cook French food at home in the United States of America. And she had been trying desperately with other cookbooks and failing miserably. And so she sort of felt like this was exactly the book that she had been waiting for, how fortunate that was. And so in that regard, she recognized the book had the power to shape American culture, to shape how Americans cooked and ate at home. And in fact, that book did just that. Julia Child did even more of that when she went on television and really became a national household name. There were other books that I would say were more accidental. And by accident, I don't mean happenstance. I mean that Judith didn't go searching for them. So examples of that would be Claudia Roden, Madhur Jaffrey, Edna Lewis. These were not cookbook authors or cuisines. So Claudia Roden, Middle Eastern food, Madhur Jaffrey, Indian, Edna Lewis, the food of the African diaspora, specifically in the American South, Virginia in particular. Judith was not looking for authors who could write cookbooks about those cuisines. What she was noticing was that American culture as a whole was changing and changing very rapidly in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And one of the ways that that cultural change was playing out was in the kinds of foods that Americans seemed to be curious about and interested in eating. And part of the way that Judith realized that was because of Craig Claiborne's work at the New York Times. He began reviewing restaurants outside of the sort of fine white tablecloth French world and began going to little hole-in-the-wall restaurants, many of them run by new immigrants to the United States. And as Judith saw that he was doing this and began to talk with other people in New York about the way that these articles were being received, she recognized that there was a place for cookbooks too. And so those two, Craig Claiborne and Judith Jones, had a great collaboration that Judith talked about over the years, where they really brought one another ideas for subjects, for stories, for books. And so in that way, I don't think there was a deliberate shaping, but there was a desire to take it further, right? So newspapers are very good at being sort of points of first exposure. I'm talking about the culture pages, not the hard news pages, right? Mm-hmm. They might alert someone, for example, to the fact that a woman named Madhur Jaffrey is living in New York City and is cooking Indian cuisine. And they might think, well, what is Indian cuisine? I've never seen it. I've never tasted it. And in fact, at the time, there really weren't any Indian restaurants to go to in New York City. And so Judith entered into that space thinking, aha, a cookbook could do an amazing thing here, which is it could introduce curious Americans, cooks and readers, to another culture and to another cuisine. Because in fact, there isn't much else by way of entry point. So there was intention, but there was so much luck. There was so much happenstance. There was so much being in the right place at the right time. And then what Judith was so good at was seizing the moment and really following those interesting people, those wonderful cooks, and drawing books out of them that then arrived to the American eating and reading public.
And do you want to take a step back and comment on the role of the editor? Because I think in some of the reading that I was done that there's a pretty big misunderstanding or this idea amongst authors and writers that editors hardly do anything and they just go to lunch and smoke cigarettes and some very old-fashioned thing, which I personally, as someone who has represented writers for decades, found sort of offensive and was horrified to learn that there's this belief. But I thought it was missing this idea of they have a lot of power in choosing what to publish. I think in the Madhur Jaffrey case, it's a little bit different because I don't think Judith was had 7 different Indian cookbook manuscripts to choose from. That just wasn't where it was at the time. But she might have done for French, or she might have done in other things. So how do you look at not just Judith, but the role of the editor as a cultural gatekeeper or guide, or do they have too much power?
It's a really good question. And I think it's always really important to look at the particular historical and cultural moment that someone is or was editing in. So one of the things that was really important to me to point out in this book, in The Editor, was that it wasn't until after World War II that editors began to have really outsized roles in terms of shaping books, in terms of shaping manuscripts. So before that, and this was a quote directly from Alfred Knopf, actually, manuscripts came in and publishers printed them as they came in. There was very little handling of the language. Sometimes they might be working to translate a manuscript that was written in a language other than English, but otherwise they mostly left it alone. It wasn't until after the war ended and there was an explosion in American interest in reading that editors began to have a larger role because, as you said, they became very important gatekeepers of culture. That one could argue they always had been, but as many, many more Americans began reading and as publishing expanded, the editors' role expanded along with it. And so they became arbiters of culture in a way. But the other thing that they did and still do that I think is lost to most of the general public is that they are the link between the talent, quote unquote, the talent, right? The author, the writer, and the publisher and the publishing industry, which is a business. And so they have to be able to walk both sides of that very, very carefully. They have to understand the economics of publishing to some extent. They have to understand the marketplace, what is going to sell in a given cultural moment, right? Something that hit big in 1961 might not have done so well in 1985. And if someone stays in the publishing industry as an editor, they need to understand the difference and why, be able to read and refract the culture in that way. But then they also have to be able to develop trust and rapport and intimacy with their authors so that their authors will take advice, right? Will be willing to push their work, their manuscript, to be better. And if they don't trust their editor, they're not going to do that. And so I think it calls upon 2 very, very, very different skill sets. There are other skills that Judith in particular exercised that I think you see editors doing a lot less of these days. Judith did a lot of the marketing and publicity work for her early books, her early cookbooks in particular, because there were no publicity departments in publishing yet. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that she took it upon herself to help a book find its audience, not just its buyers, but to sort of place it in the larger cultural milieu, right? To understand where it might land, where it might resonate and with whom, and how to get it into their hands or in front of them was something that certain editors, certain genre editors in particular, have excelled at over time. And Judith was exceptional at it. She understood how to do it, in part because she had worked in early publicity with Gore Vidal in particular, right after the war ended. And so she understood that books needed help finding an audience and that the publisher had a role to play in that. And then she took it upon herself to fulfill that role when no one else was doing it with her books at Knopf.
Well, I think that's an interesting parallel to Julia, which is you're kind of describing how Judith's career matured right in lockstep with publishing into what is now the way modern publishing works after some course corrections, and that Julia had a similar career in food where she was inventing a lot of the milieu, particularly food television. And again, underscore, she's not the first cookbook writer and she's not the first woman to cook on TV, but she was the first to have such a broad influence. And yes. They, just as you say, they were 2 people whose careers depended, were interlinked to each other's. They also both kind of were of the culture while making the culture.
Absolutely. They were both game changers in their particular fields, in their particular genres. And they were both so tireless, right? So it's not only that both of them could see what could be done or what needed to be done to elevate a show or a book. It was that they then took it upon themselves to do it. And they had that moxie, they had that sense of rigor, that sense of belief in a project that allowed them to find the energy, to really dig deep, to find the energy to do this tireless work of bringing work to an audience.
Let us know what you think of today's show. Send us an email or a voice memo to contact@juliachildfoundation.org. We'll be right back.
When you flip anything, you just have to have the courage of your convictions, particularly if it's sort of a loose mass like this. Well, that didn't go very well. See, when I flipped it, I didn't have the courage to do it the way I should have. But you can always pick it up, and if you're alone in the kitchen, who is going to see?
From Julia's immortal words, we move into our last segment, which we call the Julia moment. Here's when we ask our guests to share their favorite Julia memory moment or how she's inspired them in their career. Not many people get to give us more than one, but Sarah, what's your second Julia moment upon reflection all these 100 episodes later?
It really has evolved. And part of the reason it's evolved is because I've spent much of the past several years so deep and steeped in the correspondence between Judith and many of her authors, particularly Julia Child, and trying to really make sense of their early relationship, you know, how it unfolded, why it unfolded the way it did, and what they each gave to the other. And one of the things that has sort of struck me again and again and again is that when I spoke with Judith in real time, when I was interviewing her in 2013 and I was talking with her about Julia, I was asking Judith about feminism in the office and in particular about pay equity and about how she sensed that she was valued in the workplace. And she was very quick to say to me, well, I wasn't. You know, in fact, it was the other way around. I was put down. My work with food in particular was diminished. People at Knopf did not take it seriously. They certainly didn't take it seriously until Mastering the Art of French Cooking took off. And then, you know, the folks at Knopf did a little bit of a 180 and began to rethink. But that Julia was such an advocate for Judith early in Judith's career at Knopf after they began working together. As Julia saw that this book was taking off, that Mastering was really finding a place in the world, that it was beginning to do well, it was selling, it was making Knopf money, she really advocated for Judith to stand up and fight. These are the words that Judith gave me, for herself, to be recognized in the workplace, to be compensated better, to have more sway. You know, Judith was the only person at Knopf who had published a cookbook, really had from beginning to end, had worked on a book with an author to make it better, to make it its best, and to bring it to the world. And so Julia's argument was, no one knows this genre better than you do. You deserve to be recognized for that talent, for that skill, for that labor. And Judith was someone who had a very difficult time sort of asking for that credit, asking for more money, asking to be, you know, treated as worthy of her worth. And so I love that it was Julia Child insistently and repeatedly in the background who, over a course of years, kept saying to Judith, you know, you deserve more, you deserve better. And it wasn't specifically as a woman, but it was in part, of course, because they were both women of a shared generation, that they understood the ways in which women's work and their worth was regularly diminished and devalued, both in our culture, in the kitchen, and in the workplace.
That's really neat. I'm really happy that you brought that up, and I can see Julia just had that steel, and I'm not talking about nerves of steel. She just had steel, and she really had this belief that you need to fight for your worth. And I think if she was here, she would say it wasn't just if you were a woman, dearie, but inherently, it as you say, it was a bigger deal to fight for your worth as a woman, particularly during that time period. And as the data shows, this is still an issue.
Absolutely.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for coming back on and talking to us about Judith Jones and Julia. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a treat.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. For more, it's at Sara B. Franklin on Instagram. The book is The Editor: How Publishing Legend Judith Jones Shaped Culture in America. It's out now from Simon & Schuster's Atria Books. Ask or search for it at your favorite bookseller. Save the date for the next Santa Barbara Culinary Experience, May 12th to 18th, 2025. Follow at SB Culinary Experience on Instagram for the latest news and updates. Go to sbce.events to join the mailing list. Find more episodes of Inside Julia's Kitchen on juliachildfoundation.org, heritageradionetwork.org, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please follow at Julia Child on Facebook and at Julia Child Foundation on Instagram and Threads for our latest news. It's at T. Schulkin on Instagram and Threads. The Julia Child audio clip for The French Chef is used with permission from our friends at GBH, thanks to my co-producer at the Foundation, Lauren Solkeld, and our sound engineer is Gabe Jean. Our theme song is New French Horn by Novi Valtorni. We look forward to bringing you back into the Foundation's world next time on Inside Julia's Kitchen.